Yeah, it's quite amazing, this one. This is one of the very few that I haven't seen much of at all, really. I remember
saw it
watching
when it came out.
Yes,
and I loved it. It's one of those that I've deliberately not seen since. I've sort of wanted to preserve it. Although watching it this time, I went, hang on, this is the nightmare version of my own life. I'm always in these bloody places.
Yeah, there was a lot of very weird association going on this time, because I like giallo, I like a lot of that stuff, but there's no denying. I mean, when you read into the history of it, the depths of misogyny and of the abuse of women that happens in that arena is it's an exploitation arena, isn't it? And indeed a sexploitation arena. There's no denying it, and this film just goes for it, just comments upon it, exposes it completely.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a really interesting tension in the film, actually, isn't it? Because it's clearly being made by somebody who's in love not only with that genre,
right,
but the entire world that goes with it, the world it comes from.
Yeah, it's so strange, isn't it? I mean, there are like depths and layers of operation going on here that the film then compounds even further by blending them together and breaking the fourth wall and actually being very conscious of itself as a film.
I think this film does that in a very sophisticated way, that idea that in a sense we are all always going to be drawn to and celebrate certain, if you like, cultural artifacts, which to use to again employ a totally overused phrase, which are problematic. And it's all about how we as human beings in the 21st century do it. It's that thing about recognizing and acknowledging the problems with texts or productions, and at the same time still being able to being mature enough to say, do you know what, I'm going to factor in all that, and I'm not going to duck it, and I'm not going to deny it. I'm also going to make my claim for why in other respects it's still important, but I'm not going to do that terribly childish thing of going, well, no, because I fell in love with this when I was a teenager or when I was 8 or when and therefore it can't possibly be any of the things that you're.
Yes, absolutely. It's the Lovecraft effect, isn't it? It's the Lovecraft effect. It's the C.S. Lewis effect, where you fall in love with this stuff when you are a child, when you are a teenager. They're formative texts, so they're very important to you. But then you start to mature, you start to learn you swell into greater contexts, and you start to understand that, yes, there are massively problematic elements to both the work and the creators of that work.
Yes, and I think one of the things it also does very well is it shows the other blade of that sword, really, which is something we talked about in a previous podcast, which is this notion of the terrible pitfalls of making something, particularly perhaps for film directors, where the very thing we talked about it in context of Pier Pasolini and so on, where the thing you wish to achieve, you can blunder into kind of replicating or reproducing.
Well, that commentary is explicit, isn't it? It's implicit in the film. I mean, you actually have that justification from what's his name, the guy who's actually behind the entire project. He actually
Santini.
says, Santini, that's right. Oh, I hate it. I hate what was done to these women. And then, of course,
beautiful women.
Right. And then, of course, it turns out that he is replicating those exact factors, those exact situations. He is just the postmodern manifestation of the same misogyny, right?
Yeah, and Sylvia, in her message, she even makes that explicit, doesn't she? She compares his wandering hands to the priests probing for witch marks.
Right.
And that's like a camera going in close as well. The all-seeing eye constantly looking. Interesting that it did make me laugh that Santini, of course, is means little saint, which I thought that's got to have been done deliberately. There's quite a few moments, little details in this where I think, I wonder why that was chosen. I went off and looked, and I found out that I mean, some of these might be accidental. The other one that occurred to me was like, I kept thinking, why Dorking? Why Dorking of all places? And then I discovered that the symbol of the chicken of Dorking is linked with Milan.
Oh,
Really?
right.
Because that's the way my head works. It's like I always give an author or a director or anything the benefit of the doubt on why they've chosen a name. I'm not saying it's always freighted with symbolism, but
Right.
but usually someone is thinking of something, even if it's, and I thought, oh right, there's a Milan connection in Dorking. How fascinating. So
There was
we
one
might
that
return to that.
that's brilliant. There was one that occurred to me, which is that in our last conversation, when we were talking about the witch, I raised Silvia Federici and her analysis of the witch trials, in Europe, and her historical analysis for that. And I can't help noticing that the woman in this film who not only sees most clearly what's going on and also turns out to be in rebellion against it. Her first name is Sylvia. I don't know how familiar Peter Strickland is with the autonomous Marxist feminist writing. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that is fascinating, isn't it? But given the nature of the text, this film is one of those films where you can't watch it casually. It is so freighted with symbolism and with visual imagery that feeds into a wider mythology. Right. I mean, that's what's impressed me more than anything. It's one of those wonderful films that is so aware of its own medium that it takes into account every sphere of it, not just the visual, but the audio as well.
But superficially, you think you've made a film entirely set in a sound studio. How the hell did you sell this? And I'm so glad you did, because it is just superficially, it is singularly such an interesting environment to plunge it, and yet it is anti-cinematic in many respects.
Right. I mean, it's dark. It's kind of dull, isn't it? It's difficult to actually light and to make visually interesting or dynamic.
Well, the closest analogy would be to cinema would be, well, you're in the projection room. That's where you are. I mean,
and also it's contained as well, isn't it? I mean, it's very small. It's coffin-like. It's very, very difficult to move, for actors to move about, for cameras to move about.
In fact, it's one of the reasons, of course, we're here is that these things are, all the texts we've been exploring are hauntological, or they are ghost stories in some ways, and they are designed to frighten us. I cannot tell you how, because I'd forgotten it as a detail, but how chilled I was, how frightened I was by the simple conceit of suddenly his room was in the studio.
I was freaked out by that. I was when it happened this time round. I had a night. It's almost like a nightmare transition, isn't it? It's one of the. It actually creates this sensation that this is not a literal space. That space and time are kind of collapsing here. It's very freaky.
Just on a very visceral level, the fact that this guy is trapped in darkness all the time. Because of course the implication, I think, is that there is quarters, rooms that he's renting somewhere, but when he just goes through and oh my god, that now the spaces are now stacked together, that's for various reasons. It's just existentially terrifying.
It's brilliant. I mean, it is absolutely brilliant. It is at the point where the logic of the film is breaking down alongside Gilderoy's mind, so everything, spatial, audio, everything is just collapsing together. It's also at the point where he starts, of course, speaking in fluent Italian.
Yeah, well, and dressing differently. Of course, he starts dressing more like them. The other two, well, the two Italian, the principal Italian characters that we meet represent the film. He starts to dress like them. There are little details of Gilderoy, but the color scheme has changed. So he matches them far more, and they put more Brill cream through Toby Jones's hair. But actually, I think this is one of the things I'm sure we'll touch on, because to do with very obvious signifiers, and actually the rather intelligent way obvious signifiers and stereotyping has been done in this film.
But it's fascinating, isn't it, that semi-consciously we're still on very much the same sort of track. I mean, obviously, in this series of podcasts, we've been talking about the connection between the uncanny and the uncanny in media and the very fact that we are dealing with media.
Yeah.
Uncanny media's awareness of itself as media, and its conceptualization of the uncanny as something fundamentally of media.
Yep.
That is, we began with The Changeling, where we talked about Joseph as a kind of recording who plays himself through the medium of the house. He appears most particularly in the reel-to-reel tape of the seance, and he seems to be able to record people's voices and play them back, etc. And then we get, the whole thing is about a musical composer who records and plays back his own compositions, etc.
Right.
And then we go into the stone tape, which is intensely about again, we talked about how Ghostwatch and the stone tape are kind of like sister productions,
more or less sequels to one another. More or less.
And this feels like another part in the same series.
Absolutely. I mean, the way this frames some of the things that goes on, well, like when he's doing the Foley stuff with the knives and the melons and whatnot, there is what I got from it this time. There's almost like a ritualistic element to it. It's like he is replicating some kind of ritual sacrifice, which is a cult, and which is conjuring something very, very dark and very unpleasant. Besides the fact that it's this film's very clever way of replicating what happens in giallo cinema, i.e. the very overt violence and physical mutilation. It conjures that beautifully.
One of the things it does through that as well, and one of the things that sort of leapt out at me, and I thought, again, it's just this really interesting little wrinkle to add to all the wrinkles in this film. In a sense, there's this fascinatingly conservative connotation at work here, which obviously we're presented with this very stereotypical restrained, repressed Englishman confronting this sensual fascistic Italians who are
it's so uncomfortable, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
You're anticipating one of my readings.
Boy, I'm sure. Yeah. But disturbed to the point of being complicit in torture, but obviously via the images he's seeing and the work he undertakes. But the problem that the film, I think, just starts prodding away at is the problem with the sort of pearl clutching of the Mary Whitehouse and the National Viewers and Listeners Association becomes really interesting, bounced off this film as a text, because the problem with Mary Whitehouse and the National Viewers and Listeners Association was always that there's a kernel of truth in what they were arguing. They just misrepresented and misinterpreted what the truth was. They got it warped. But there is no doubt that some of the things they were getting near were right. They were just saying the loud part, the silent part's loud because they were all a bunch of reactionaries, and they were saying they weren't saying the loud bits, which is, of course, media, images, sound, those kind of experiences do have a singular effect on us depending on the intensity of the thing we're experiencing. And this film, I think, really starts pushing at that. And one of the things that comes out of it is it could be very easy to misinterpret this film as quite a conservative, making quite a conservative statement.
Yes, if you look at it in the sense that it somehow Gilderoy is warped by his experiences in the sound studio, which is not a reading I go for myself, because I'm not sure to what degree anything is literal here.
Yeah,
it depends on a very literal reading of the text, which I think the film itself defies completely.
Although, on another note, and I won't go into this now because, as I say, I'm sure we've got a great deal to wade through, but of all the films that we have seen and then got together to do podcasts on, this is the one that sort of without me doing it has given me the most singular, by which I mean single, interpretation. I sort of came away at this time and I thought, okay, this is going to be interesting to hear from George and Jack, because I now cannot get off what a sort of accidental, albeit subjective, but definitive reading that I've got of it at the moment. I tried to, but this is the film that I've got the most concrete grasp of compared to anything else we've watched. And that's not to denigrate it. I think it's still a magnificent film, and I think there's more rabbit holes available. But I did come away with almost unwittingly, right, I think I've got my idea what this film is about. We obviously get with Gilderoy this we get that sort of surface gloss of everything that we expect of a kind of Middle England, a middle class Englishman of a certain type that Gilderoy represents. And of course, we're also become quickly aware that there is this quite complex human being buried underneath that classic middle-aged, middle-class, Middle England signifiers, the unmarried mummy's boy. We get this things about Norman Bates creep into the text, and and things.
Almost certainly a virgin,
Yeah. And someone who, to my mind, seems to construct a racist caricature of Italian filmmakers who work on films he has perhaps been tempted to peep into, or has. And obviously we see him working through his mother's letters that are wonderful because they subvert that pastoral world he obviously works on in his documentaries about. But now it's the place where magpies eat chiff-chaff chicks and their parents
the degeneration of the letters, it sort of echoes the degeneration of the film. It's almost really disturbing.
We're seeing the negative of another film. The film's going on in Dorking, and in fact I think the film in a sense is going on in Dorking. That's certainly space that the narrative of his life and the Italian movie on a screen. So we see him fight with a woman who he believes is trying to stab him, of course, reflecting that fear and awkwardness around women which permeates the film.
My God, that is just so much part of this film in general, isn't it?
Absolutely woven into it.
Misogyny is one of the throbbing veins of this film.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can't get away from it. And so where I sort of came away from the film thinking, some men go to their shed to have a hobby and get away from a few hours, and Gilderoy goes down to the shed and works through a deeply traumatized mental state driven by fear of women, perhaps an omnipresent mother, a repressed sexuality which transgresses into this kind of voyeuristic desire for torture porn, and where I was particularly taken with the Silencio, because it seemed to me that that was his greatest wish amidst the noise of those competing nightmares. And I think what actually saves him from being the "be careful of the loner man" trope is that we see him fighting to be social. We see him fighting at times to overcome being a bullied man.
I think one of the most, they are the most uncomfortable scenes.
Yes, they are. But ultimately, he acquiesces. I think he becomes like the Italian filmmakers he has created. As I said, he dresses more like them. He does engage in torture. He is more complicit. And finally, almost, and this time it is Ingmar Bergman, not Dreyer, he becomes absorbed into the film almost persona-like, where the thing becomes like a mental black hole that just absolutely sucks him in. And that was my takeaway. Now, I am certainly willing to be told that's a terribly reductive reading, or there's much more to it than that. But that just felt, in the moment, second ever viewing, kind of right for me.
Well, looking at it metaphysically, what I felt was that it echoed most of the texts we've already explored, including The Shining, which Jack and I did with Kit a week or so ago. There is this sense that somehow there is something metaphysical going on here in the set. It's almost like he is absorbed into something else, into the film, or into the strange culture around the film.
But I just felt that sorry, I'll just quickly say, I just felt that the self-image, the Gilderoy self-image, and what he creates, with a few exceptions, is almost we're playing with the grotesque. Obviously, I don't mean the grotesque just in the sense of what is harrowing and macabre, but in the Ionescian sense of grotesque as well. These are because they are very rough stereotypes. But the more you go into, it's like this is a man's perception, and it's been informed by so much of the era he's lived through and the history around it, and what is happening in the media that he is connected to. I mean, obviously, you mentioned Giallo earlier, and I mean that's a classic example. And suddenly, we're getting at this point where he exists in the 70s. I mean, I always say this about the 70s. Whenever I look at the DVDs on my shelf, because I put them in a in order of year rather than genre. It's just my easiest way to reference anything. And you hit the 70s, and you're suddenly not only in the era of things like Giallo, but even in the mainstream, you're into the era of things like Straw Dogs and things like that, where Chinatown, where suddenly the leap, even before the infamy of the video nasties or Lucio Fulci films or Deodato films, the mainstream of the 70s itself, Race with the Devil, whatever, it takes a really violent turn.
Yeah,
and it is confronting. I mean, it's so different to the 60s.
Yeah.
And I just think that's all caught in it as well.
Yeah. I would certainly want to link, hopefully in a non-reductive, non-mechanistic way,
I've already done that.
Yeah. No. I don't think you have at all.
No, but I don't think so. I think that's.
I would certainly I mean, it's true. In the 70s, you suddenly get this explosion of transgressive media.
Well, the whole exploitation movement becomes enormous, doesn't it? It's pervasive at that point.
But it pushes the mainstream as well. It pushes. It's like the violent Overton window is. It pushes it in the mainstream as well.
Totally.
But it strays into all areas, doesn't it? I mean, you even have like people like Ralph Bakshi around this era creating like violent and sexual cartoons like Fritz the Cat.
Of course, yes, yeah.
Fascinating, yeah. God, there's so much there. As I say, I'd want to link the change in media at that period, hopefully in a non-reductive, non-mechanistic way, to the fact that Western capitalist society is engaged in its biggest fundamental structural transition for a very long time, which is the switch from fundamentally, to use the terms very loosely, social democratic economies to neoliberal economies.
Right.
Which has I mean, we talked a little bit about this when we looked at the film Joker, and about how Joker very consciously expresses the sort of the social experience of that incredibly traumatic rupture moment in Western culture.
I think we also discussed how that is informed by what happened in the 60s, where you have these incredible youth movements that are so powerfully apart from everything their parents stood for.
One of the things that people have written about neoliberalism is that it is, at least in part, a cultural counter-revolution against exactly that. Yeah,
right.
And I think this film might, in some way, recognize this, because I felt the key line of the film is a new world of sound awaits you, a new world that requires all your magic powers. That to me seemed to be the key line, and I thought that line is doing a tremendous amount of heavy lifting for so many aspects of this film. And particularly the reference to magic, I thought was very interesting.
Well, that brings us back to, one of the 714 things that you've both said now that I want to respond to, which is the thing that George was talking about earlier, which is the exact sort of metaphysical nature of literally what is happening in the narrative.
What is happening? I think it's very open-ended this way. I think this is more open-ended than any of the texts we've actually explored thus far.
By far the most. It's radically open-ended, and one of the things you encounter when you read reviews, particularly reviews by non-professional reviewers, ordinary people, for want of a better term, who are responding to this without the pressure to look clever like a film critic, you know what I mean, is a lot of confusion about what happens in the film's final third, and I think absolutely justified, because it is confusing.
Right, it's designed to be, surely. Exactly. It's meant to be, isn't it? Because you don't just have the breakdown of the internal universe, the narrative. It actually breaks the fourth wall. It actually bleeds into the film itself and your experience of watching the film, right? So it's like the film they're creating. What is it called? The Equestrian Vortex and the Berberian Sound Studio itself they start to overlap and interbleed, and then you're drawn into it. Your perception of the film is drawn into the experience, and suddenly everything is chaos.
That overlapping and interbleeding starts right at the beginning, almost sort of unnoticed. It happens, and you kind of go, "Oh, that's funny," and then you just forget about it. Which is that the opening title sequence for Berberian Sound Studio is actually the opening title sequence,
right?
For
to Equestrian Vortex. Yeah.
But that bit in the latter third, the last reel, so to speak, where suddenly you switch to, I mean, the film is already destabilizing the boundaries between reality, fantasy, dream, etc., and indeed cinema. It's not just eroding within the context of the cinematic presentation. It's not just eroding the difference between quote unquote reality. There you go again. Reality as ideology comes up over and over again, and dreams or imagination or delusion or madness or whatever you want to say. It's not just eroding that distinction. It's also eroding the distinction between those two things and a third thing, which is the cinematic form itself. It's actually bringing itself into this sort of into this system of the boundaries eroding. But it's already doing that. And then you get to the amazing bit where you cut to Gilderoy's bedroom and it goes completely silent.
Yeah.
Because as it goes on, you realize, right, I'm watching the print before the sound has been added.
Right.
Yes.
And then somebody says, bring in the sound or something. And you suddenly get the dub coming in. You get the sound effects and the voice. And it's not only that, it's also the moment where Gilderoy has become a character in a story, right? Essentially the story in the film, where the vengeful victim of misogyny, and except that she's not really, because witches are real in this, which again, something else we've talked about before. So and she has to be put down. So ultimately, any claim this story has to be about the vengeful victims of misogyny and patriarchy getting their revenge.
Yes,
turns out to be hollow, because of course
doesn't quite stand.
As always in these sorts of narratives about anxiety, the revenge taken for the crimes of the oppressor thus invalidates the claims, the moral claims of the oppressed. So because the oppressor then has to put down the rebellion. That's what's happening in that scene. And then that is the moment where the film completely sort of slips all its fixed points. The two stories have mixed into each other, and the form and the content have mixed into each other. Right, so there's no longer a clear distinction between there is no longer any diegesis in any clear sort of normal sense.
And it's a real mistake to try and discern it or define it. It really is. You are missing the point by trying to unpick that.
You kind of want to sort of say to people who are confused and upset about that, you kind of that sense of vertigo you're experiencing, that's not actually something to complain about.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Plus, that's what you're meant to feel.
So surrounded, ever since the beginning of the 20th century, now going into, and it's a point that we discussed on the Blair Witch Project, I think, which is, if the 21st century just symbolically should do anything about film, which is a 20th century art form, it should interrogate what film is. Now, of course, there's always there's never a clear cut between eras, because people like Ingmar Bergman, who we mentioned earlier, Persona, this film has touchstones with Persona. They're doing that from the 60s, because obviously the 60s ideology and reality again is a radical time. It might be the ending of a radical time rather than a beginning, or just just like a puff of smoke. But we're surrounded by film, and we're surrounded by audio, and we're surrounded by synthetic things. That's our life now, and our media, and therefore this film really does get to the heart of the idea of we have sort of slipped our moorings when it comes to what is real. I mean, it already starts anyway in the, I mean, just to speak very crudely about it, but obviously the 20th century is where you get the three major ideas that sort of shake the century, which is time and space are not what you thought they were, Einstein. Your dreams are full of potent meanings, Freud, and you've got Darwin, and you've got Marx. So and all these ideas are going through God. And Nietzsche, God is dead. And all this has shaken the 20th century. And then now we're in the media age, of course. So this idea, I think, it just utterly frightens people. And I've had the conversation like with friends and family members who just get a bit shaken with films that quote unquote don't make sense.
Ambiguity,
and I think it's because they're on a level they're it's that, back to the grotesque again, the idea that the films that do that are showing you something realer than real.
Right. Not to get too old man about it, but I do think we've also been rather coddled and glutted by media that's designed to comfort us.
Social
that's
realism
to
was, social realism had, or and in film, things like Italian neorealism and things like that, they certainly had their function. But the Brits in particular, because of the long impact of things like Kathy Come Home, which I think we mentioned, and the attachment to social realism. But social realism only actually deals with a fragment of reality,
right?
and not always.
And not always sincerely. Not always sincerely, right?
Because
it's
there's
often not
on it.
It's right. It's not often. It markets
giving you
itself.
easier answers. In a way.
Yeah, it markets itself as social reality, but often draws dynamics and images and situations that are as fantastical as anything you'd find in The Lord of the Rings or whatever.
Of course, and once again with this film, I couldn't help but, I know it's my hobby horse, which I apologise for, but I couldn't help but think, watching this film again, it seems like whatever we do, running in a kind of warped parallel underneath it is what I would call the mental state movies of David Lynch. Certainly everything from Blue Velvet to Inland Empire, and of course I was struck with the Silencio because it reminded me of Mulholland Drive.
Right,
and,
even the lighting in this film, certain moments, is very Dario Argento, isn't it?
And Dario Argento as well, but with Lynch's obsession with sound as well. I mean, Lynch does his own sound. It's one of the things I noticed when they did the Twin Peaks The Return series, and it was coming out of a curmudgeonly old man thing, which was I was watching it every week going, why is it I can hear everyone's dialogue? Why is it I can hear it? Because I can never hear the fucking dialogue on most modern drama. I always have the subtitles on, even if it's English speaking. And then I was watching the credits one night and it said senior sound supervisor David Lynch, senior dub supervisor David Lynch. He micromanages sound, and sound is such a massive part of his movies, and in some ways more so than the visual image. And watching Berberian sound, I wonder if he's seen this and what he makes of it.
Yeah.
It's almost like one of his films in negative.
Yeah, there is definitely a Lynchian quality certainly towards the end, and even in the editing,
without overplaying its hand, because I wouldn't want to take anything away from what Strickland's doing. I think he's got a really good vision of his own, especially because the whole bloody beginning of the thing feels like we're going to go into the remake of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Right.
Like
it's classic Channel 4 film.
It's so sedate, isn't it? It's so sedate at the beginning. I mean, for the longest time as well. I mean, that maybe people have an issue with that too. The fact that the film has a slightly almost Jekyll and Hyde quality about it, where it transitions very quickly into
strictly speaking, it has no plot. I mean, strictly speaking, and I have no truck with that at all. I think plot is often overrated. It's got something better than plot.
Firstly, it's one of those films where very little happens and yet it's riveting. Just aesthetically, it's riveting. The film manages to make you. Certainly, I'm just glued to it because I'm just fascinated by it.
About nothing.
Its own fascination with just the aesthetics of life, just the existence of a spider.
It loves people's faces. Have you noticed this? This film loves people's faces. There are these very tight close-ups,
and they've got good faces to do it as well.
Yeah, and it's
interesting
absolutely
faces.
Very interesting faces. Yeah, and it's absolutely in love not only with sound, because the sound design is incredible. I sat down to watch this, and I very, very consciously chose to use over-the-ear headphones, stereo headphones, because you need to basically. It's fascinated with sound. It's in love with sound, but it's also in love with the aesthetics of sound production, and sound work. It's in love with wheels and reels of tape and reels of tape spinning and moving around and
chains and Foley
gorgeous. I was thrilled that Strickland went and had extensive interviews with Peter Howell from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. That just thrills me.
Well,
they sat down together and
Just to go off on this little digression, just briefly, don't you think like Gilderoy is kind of one of those people, one of those geniuses that used to work?
I think he is a version of Delia Derbyshire, because Delia Derbyshire as well. I mean, one of the great moments of being connected to.
I mean, he said he works on children's television programs and he makes UFOs. And, but
one of the great moments of being connected to Doctor Who as an actor was I did one convention and I met Dick Mills, who was I think the most credited man on the original series of Doctor Who, because he did all the sound. And he's he's a lovely guy and everything, but he was talking about Delia Derbyshire and he was saying about her, she had a lot of problems in her life, and mental health problems. She had an alcohol problem, and given some of the ways that Gilderoy is presented to us, I thought he does seem informed by something that is connected with Delia Derbyshire. These incredible, just eccentric genii who were just mucking around with. And again, it comes back to your point about the era of social democracy, Jack. This is a period where the public service broadcast just went, just go and experiment. We don't know what we're going to do with it, but just go off and piss around with bits of tape and oscillators, and we'll pay you.
Yeah.
And
in his home context, Gilderoy is going to be, in his own very quiet and nerdy and small c conservative English way, he's going to be an experimerator, an explorer with this aesthetic landscape. The
exploration of inner space, isn't it?
Yes.
But I love that. Is there a better line then? Is there a better line in the whole film? Because the other thing I think we really must get onto at some point, this film is funny. Is there a better line in the whole film then? I don't like to get technical.
That's
oh my God, the laugh. I mean,
do you believe in God? I don't like to get technical.
Film. It's such an intense moment.
I just punched the air at that point. I thought that's so good.
Like the unspoken levels of tension that are going on here, the whole conflict between different cultures, and then you get this line that punctures the whole thing.
It's glorious, isn't it?
It's so funny. It's so funny. I was surprised to get a laugh at it, but it does it it actually does the comedy in a very clever way. It's not like laugh out loud funny. It actually gives you just reams and reams of tension, and it piles it on and piles it on and piles it on, and then it undercuts it. It's like having something sharp with a dessert that's really rich.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. I mean, it's
absolutely funny as well. How again, just thinking about the run of films we've watched, and I include The Witch, although The Witch had less obvious connection with media, although it did, but less obvious. How one of the things that seems to happen in these films, and other things I can think of even that we haven't covered, is that in an attempt to get at the media component, that these are things about media, the only way they can actually do it is to become theatrical.
Yeah.
These are all stage plays.
Yeah, well,
Which was a stage play.
This was
it was,
into
yes,
a stage
it was,
play subsequently, wasn't it? Yeah.
Which I didn't see.
Absolutely right. Parenthetically, there is a sense in which The Witch is very much about media. We didn't get onto
this.
It's a bit
more I can't say it. Tangential. It's a bit more. Yeah.
It's a lot more tangential. You're absolutely right. But there is a sense, and this was an avenue we could have gone into. The Witch podcast, was long enough as it was. But
it was a good one. That was a good one.
Oh, it's good. Yeah, we did talk briefly about how loads and loads and loads of the dialogue in The Witch comes directly from transcripts from the time.
Yes.
Well, that's media, isn't it? That's
it is.
Recording.
Absolutely.
They wrote down as fact in transcripts of trials. At this point, the witnesses were attacked by invisible spirits. And things like that. That is media recording in the sense of almost like their version of what we would call a special effect.
Yes.
Except just in prose, recording, ideology as reality.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the context of the experience, we're the invisible spirits, are we not? We're the invisible spirits. We're there sharing this very private grief, and we're watching this family. We're haunting this family in many respects.
Yes, yeah.
The future is haunting them,
yeah.
But
Toby Jones, I mean, my God, I mean, he's one of those actors that doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't actually have to like move or talk or anything. He has this presence about him and a particular look that is just wonderful. He's just, well, I can see why he's so ubiquitous.
But plus, of course, inevitably, he's wonderful in and of himself, but of course he freights in all our knowledge of that family connection because he's Freddie Jones's son.
Yeah.
So we have that antecedent thing as well, because Freddie Jones obviously was a great actor in the genre, a really fun, exuberant actor in the genre, and the one he did so much, of course, but the part always springs to my mind is he did one or two, I think, of the old Granada Sherlock Holmes, where he plays the sort of, when Lestrade isn't in it that week, he and he's particularly glorious in those as this sort of
yes, he is good,
relishing every line. But yeah, so there's this. I got the feeling of like, oh my gosh, if this film was made in the 70s and it was a low budget British film, Freddie Jones would be playing this part.
So to have his son is just, it's perfect, isn't it? It's absolutely perfect. But also in contrast, I mean, one of the reasons they picked Toby Jones aesthetically is because of the contrast to every single beautiful Italian person, and they are every single one of them. The men are stunning. They are stunning. They're also vile, but
Toby Jones is very much sort of a non-English person's stereotypical idea of an English
totally
or a
depressed.
certain
I mean, like not even like asexual, but sexless. He's like a doll or something, isn't he? He's almost inhuman in this situation.
Well,
he's so alien.
Yeah, and he's one of those actors that in a different way to someone like John Hurt, but not entirely, where they exist in a kind of strange, nebulous thing where you can't quite work out their height. You can't quite work out the proportions of the planes of their face. So when they're in a close-up, and Hurt was the same, they look very fascinating. Although I think Hurt, he was striking. He had a sexuality about him.
Yeah, Hurt was striking. Yeah, but, definitely craggily striking.
But they sort of, they're liminal actors in a way.
Yeah.
You can't quite nail down things about them, and in a way, it's their strength.
Definitely. I mean, there's a reason why Toby Jones does a lot of like genre stuff now. Like why he appears in Doctor Who, for example.
Well, it's quite funny actually, because I when he did his Who, and I remember thinking, I mean, if this was still the era of social democracy, he'd be playing it.
Right.
That's right. In any sane world, the roles of Toby Jones as the Dream Lord and Matt Smith as the Doctor would have been reversed.
Nothing underscores the era we're in quite like putting those two men, those two actors, in the same scenes together, and then you realize how upside down the world is. It's like, oh, he's playing the lead. Oh, well, right. Yeah.
Bizarrely, Doctor Who keeps doing that. He did it recently with the most recent series, where there's a whole storyline with another Doctor turns up, and the actress playing the other Doctor is so much more compelling, so much better. And you want, I want to follow her. I want to follow her. No, don't drag me back. No.
But it's that thing of no. It doesn't matter if you're told whichever program it is, whichever series or serial or film franchise it is, that this has got one single person running it. Say, but it's one single person running it who is absolutely filled up with the era of neoliberalism. So even if they don't get a focus group, they're thinking of a focus group,
right?
And it's everywhere. It's in what people wear, it's the kind of casting, it's everything.
These people have all got focus groups inside their heads now.
Exactly,
in the same way that mainstream journalists have installed their own sensors inside their own heads.
Exactly. It's exactly the point. And you think, well, so don't try and fob us off with an auteur. An auteur cannot exist in this period. except very much at the fringes of culture.
That's absolutely true. And again, it ties back to what we were talking about earlier, why so many people will react to this film and this kind of film in a very negative way. Part of it is that we've become used to media making us not feel anything but comfort. Nothing else.
And constructing reality for us.
Right.
For a very long, I mean, we talked about this before, again, in the Ghostwatch episode particularly. We've become so accustomed to the fact that, we socially understand reality as what media says it is, as fundamentally a media construction. And I think, obviously there is some truth to the idea that in a world where most narrative media is steadfastly, dogmatically, quote unquote, realist, what again touched upon this recently, what Peter Watkins called the monoform.
Yes.
This particular iteration of what of how the media summons up what it calls reality. There's going to be just a degree of unfamiliarity with anything that doesn't do that. People are going to go,
exactly.
But there's also it's also just, I think, on some level, people find it incredibly threatening, isn't it? Because it's media suddenly turning around and saying, actually, you know how 99% of the time I tell you that reality works like this? Actually, I've been lying to you. And again, that's what Ghostwatch does.
Yeah, it's that whole Ghostwatch thing, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, media can lie to you. Media can make you feel things that it didn't before, or that you're not used to it.
But even more fundamentally, media is not reality. Media is a representation of reality that is produced, that is created by somebody and sold to you or fed to you. And media like this that sort of slaps you around the face with that and demands you think about it. It's almost like a betrayal. People react to it like a betrayal.
You see symptoms of it all over the place, particularly from our generation. What I find, certainly from people my age who were born in the 1980s, who were just bombarded with all kinds of media from the first instance. We are so informed by media, it's unbelievable, because of course the advent of home media, VHS and whatnot, we are all victims of that. We are all informed by the media we consumed. There is this incredible reactionary quality whenever there's a new version of, say, a 1980s cartoon or something like that dares to do anything different. The backlash is unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
Well, I mean, I watched the new She-Ra cartoon.
So good.
Which I would never have dreamt of doing, frankly. It's just, there's a new She-Ra. Okay, I hope the people that are into that enjoy it. Not for me, right? I would never have dreamt of doing that if I hadn't listened to you, George, talking about it with Laura Mauro.
Yes.
And you were talking about how great it was, and I thought, I need to give this a look. And it was one of the best TV shows, narrative TV shows I've seen in fucking ages. Possibly the best since Hannibal, right?
Yeah.
Now, it's incredible how badly people reacted to that. And of course, the top layer, the sort of meniscus that everybody gets, is the thing where, they've made She-Ra in less overtly sexual. It's for a male, because of course you look at these 80s cartoons for children. It is bizarre how they sexualize their female main character.
Unbelievable.
So that's sort of the top layer where it's YouTube chuds like the Quartering. They get themselves into a hissy fit because She-Ra hasn't got big boobs anymore.
Exactly right.
I think deeper than that, so much cultural expression of unease is kind of just people grabbing hold of the obvious pointy bit at the front that they can grab hold of, so to speak, that they can grasp, that they can see and easily get hold of, and they're using that as a way to express other stuff that they don't consciously get. And I think underneath so many of these, they've brought back such and such, and they've changed so and so, and the look isn't. What's actually going on is something else. Is animating this unease, that something is making people feel very threatened. And I think in the case of She-Ra, when you get into the new series, it's extremely questioning about hero narratives. Basically the entire basis of the fantasy media that our generation were fed as children.
Yeah, it takes the whole chosen one narrative and rips it apart completely.
Yeah, it's a very good example of, I think the very thing I was talking about earlier, which is, if we are going to have a 21st century a media which is an extension of things that were found in the 20th century, film and television, there's got to be a reason for it. And if it's interrogating, if it's finding, we know what the A is, what's the B, and the most successful things are the things that do that, like She-Ra.
Yeah, well, there you get into another sort of you get into a dark underbelly here, because it is successful artistically, and therefore in our age where there are audiences that are a lot more media literate and critically literate and more demanding, these things are more likely to be successful, and so they are to an extent getting made. And what that is, really, because we live in the world that we live in, is capitalism commodifying them.
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, it's inescapable, isn't it? I mean, sadly.
And that drive to do that is precisely why you end up with 712 new television shows every year that are modelled on that sort of novelistic television that supposedly started with The Sopranos, and the vast majority of them are just dreck. They dress themselves in the aesthetic of that kind of Deadwood, Sopranos, The Wire quality television without having anything like
any
that
of the content.
Yeah, it's absolutely true.
That is true. But one of the things that, because Vicky, my partner, made the point as when we reached the end of it, she said, sort of touching on what we've said about, it'd be interesting to know what level of tolerance maybe people have for a film that's entirely close-ups of switches and faces, and and I thought about it, and I started to giggle, because I said, it's interesting though, isn't it? I said, because the media that we have is so very fluid. It's so very, very good at twisting it and warping itself. And the thing that immediately came to my mind, strangely, I don't know why, but I said, it reminds me of the last third of the original Star Wars film, by which I mean the 1977 one. I said, because that is a series of close-ups of switches and VDUs and things like that, for the simple reason that they didn't have them. That the editor had said to Lucas, "Well, you've got your big dam busters thing, but there's no sense of jeopardy. It's just there's just people flying around in craft. So you need to have." So the whole thing with the Death Star maneuvering into position to blow up the rebel planet where the whole operation was being set, that was created by the editor through bits of VDU screens, and if you watch it with that knowledge, you suddenly realize all I've watched, intercutting with the occasional bit of Luke Skywalker hearing Alec Guinness and trying to aim for a porthole that Mads Mikkelsen created years later, is switches, people's eyes, VDU screens, levers, and she created everything out of that to create another narrative.
Right, so
and
all
that's
of the
what this film does in the major key.
God, this is a bit like something else that you and I, George, were talking about with Kit, which is like the sense in which The Shining is co-authored by, of course, Stanley Kubrick, but also by several other people, including the three amazing, the trio of amazing women next to him as unacknowledged co-authors, Wendy Carlos, Diane Johnson, and Shelley Duvall, who in a sense sort of redirect the film from under Kubrick.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, I thought about Wendy Carlos quite a bit watching Berberian Sound Studio. You can't help but
another genius pioneer of radiophonic experimentation. Maybe this is just narrowcasted at me and people like me, but loads and loads and loads of loving close-ups of like dials and sliders and knobs and needles and stuff like that in sound studios.
Analog technology.
Fine with me.
It's absolutely fine by me
so
too.
Beautiful, isn't it?
But it's also wonderfully contrasted, isn't it? Because contrasted to that, you have the wonderful close-ups of organic stuff like the fruit, the vegetables, the rot, the decay, the spider, of course.
Yeah, I mean,
I love the spiders.
I've got a musician friend.
I choose to believe that it's the same spider every time.
Oh, absolutely.
Me too.
Just keeps on coming back to Gilderoy.
It's got to be. It's got to be. Yeah, to work, to function, it has to be.
Yeah, I've got a musician friend, and it always amused me because now you can just pretty much do anything with something like Pro Tools or Reaper or something like that. Yeah. And he's filled his house with analog technology, all these various things. And he cuts music with bands and stuff. And he's called Rob. And I said, so, what is it? I said, is it just aesthetic reaction? Why are we doing this? Why is it the more we're given digital technology and the easier we're able to do it? Why are people like you going back to this? And he just gave some wonderfully pithy answers. He said, well, my Pro Tools won't pick up. Well, it will automatically get rid of the sound of let's say the guitarist's finger going down the string, and I want people to hear that. And I said, well, why do you want people to hear that? He said, because process is such a, and of course this film is all about process.
Right.
And I think everything that we've watched has been about, here is the cross section of what you're dealing with, and that I think maybe we used to, in the infancy of our experience of wanting to watch film, we wanted the illusion, and now we want the curtain to be pulled back a little bit.
Well, this is weird because it's like we've arrived back at a kind of Brechtianism, isn't it?
Yes.
And I think it was Owen Hatherley who talked about Brechtianism without Brecht's radical content being everywhere now, sort of. Yeah. But, I mean, that's kind of, he's kind of talking about almost cliched postmodernism. Texts that concentrate on their text,
on their meta narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is true. Meta is everywhere, but so much of it is kind of just contentless. It's just. I think that's a really good way of putting it. Brecht without the Brechtian content.
It's not actually commenting upon the nature of it. It's just
No.
Or sometimes the Brechtian content has been subbed for advertising. That's probably
very much so. Well, it's been turned into, in the quintessential postmodern move, it's been turned into empty irony. Because it's so easy to be ironic by just winking at the camera.
Right. Using an example that both of you guys know. I mean, the new Doctor Who show. It's so aware of itself as a Doctor Who show.
Right. So I don't watch it anymore. So
I've not seen it for.
It is just giant winking, essentially. It is just callbacks. It is. There's this horrible bloated complacency about it, where it relies upon its audience knowing that it's Doctor Who, and therefore it can get away with stuff. It can get away with being a bit shit, to be honest.
It's now like Doctor Who is treated as a genre in itself.
Yes,
which is a terrible mistake.
It is,
but also it's that thing of
good science fiction, right?
Again, which sort of touched. I mean, one of the things that almost became so insufferable for me was I could never not hear the author's voice.
Right.
And now, for everything I've just said about showing a cross section, it's still an area where a certain care has to be taken. Because one of the things I often found with Doctor Who in its newer form over the last 15 years is that's the writer speaking. We that it's so writerly.
There is this insufferable quality of like, look how clever I am.
It's
look
people
how
speaking with the voice of Russell T Davies or Stephen Moffat,
right.
or it's them, and that's the very thing that I want to get away. Of course, there are rich and dominant voices. The old series had Robert Holmes, for instance. You had this wonderful relish of language, but you were still able to get away from him.
Right. Whereas if you watch like other shows written by, say, Stephen Moffat, I mean, a really good example would be that awful adaptation of Dracula. It's so bad. It's so awful. But you can feel Moffat under everything.
Yeah, it's just too pronounced for me, because it's I could just hear every choice of word. Don't have the actors. You can just let him dub it.
There is this horrible bloviation to it as well. When it feels like it's people saying, "Look how clever I am," rather than trying to tell a decent story. Right?
It certainly is when it's Stephen Moffat.
At the
risk of being drawn into a total, at the risk of galloping off on my hobby horse.
We could go far into this, but like I love the book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's one of my favorite Victoria Novels ever.
It's just glorious.
That TV version he did was one of the worst things I've ever seen.
Yeah, made me want to burn the world to the ground.
I am not engaging in hyperbole there. It was one of the worst things I have ever seen.
But
yeah.
hey,
No,
this
it's
film,
painful. It's atrocious. It's an insult. It's an
But
obscenity.
it thinks it's really clever.
Yeah.
It thinks it's fantastic. It's like Sherlock. It's like the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock.
Well,
It thinks it's so clever. It's bullshit.
Well, this is why,
bullshit.
People say I'm obsessed with my Moffat hate. I maintain that it's a reaction to the fact that Stephen Moffat has something against me, because he pursues me personally across all the texts that are most important to me,
right.
and just pisses over them. He sort of signs his name on every single one of them in his own piss. He's done it to Sherlock Holmes, Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, Doctor Who. It's like, what next? You're going to adapt Capital? I mean, what the fuck is happening here?
It's true.
What did I do to you? I feel like Agrajag with Arthur Dent.
Oh, God,
what have you got against me? What did I do?
Do you know what really bothers me more than anything? Sometimes you get these glimmers of great ideas, and I mean really clever, interesting ideas. But
this is what's so frustrating, because
the ego gets
good.
The ego gets in the way. That's the problem. It trips over his own ego, and then you get bullshit. You get nonsense. It jumps the shark. It goes.
Look what we get in Berberian Sound Studio, which is you don't have where the screenplay for this is not smothered in an obvious voice. The characters are able to say lines we expect those characters to say. Secondly, it is being clever, but it's being carefully clever, and it is drawing back the veil so far. And the third thing, most importantly, it does, which of course is contrast, it refuses to over-explain itself. Which is the common disaster for most things over the last 20 years. Even things I've loved, film or television, and it's just got to that moment, oh my God, they're going to explain it. No, don't. And this film is mercifully free of this.
Oh, are we getting towards the end of Act 2? Right. It's time to get Vincent D'Onofrio to do a cameo where he turns up and explains. Well, it's this particular Babylonian demon, and he works this way. This is how he functions as a rules monster. I've got it all here in this book with unconvincing woodcuts in. Just fuck.
It's great that you've watched The Shining recently, because that's another great example of something which it slips away from you as you get close to it, and it should slip away from you. And obviously there are certain things that we have agreed maybe about The Shining, but I think just the proliferation of fucking YouTube videos on it actually shows that its greatest strength is you've all got it wrong.
I know it's a genre of YouTube video which is the end of X explained. As if every film requires its ending explained, and secondly, as if there's anything that requires explanation about the end of most of these films. Like the end of Captain America Civil War explained. Like, thanks, I don't need that. But there are loads and loads and loads, like even more than every other film now, of videos that are The Shining explained, basically. What the fuck is happening in The Shining, the 700th video, and that's simultaneously really annoying but and also great, because the fact that people feel the need to do that is, they're approaching it the wrong way, but the fact that it's done that to them is great.
You're trying to drive nails through mist. It's not going to happen.
Somebody said once that one of the things that makes Shakespeare so fascinating is that he almost seems to have deliberately done this thing over and over and over again, where when he's writing the play, he will just suddenly take out one layer of explanation or characterization.
I mean, can there be a more glorious thing about it? And it occurred to me because I reread it recently. Just to finish my
thought, Shakespeare does seriously do that when he adapts things, because almost all his plots are unoriginal. They're adapted from novels or whatever, or tales in the Decameron or whatever. When you go to the original source material, whether it's Holinshed or whoever, there is sort of vital context there in the original that causes textural problems in the play that subsequent generations of critics have scratched their heads over, that he just takes out when he adapts whoever to make his play of the same subject matter. He just takes out an explanation.
Well, it's the thing I feel like I need to smack my head against the desk when I read these criticisms or these, because the one I was thinking about was Othello. Because Othello, temporarily, is completely fucked.
Famously, it has a double time scheme.
The double time scheme.
Mm-hmm.
But the attempts to sort of say there's some sort of mistake here, or there's a weakness of the player.
Cinema sins, they've simultaneously been married a couple of days and a week. Ding!
Yeah, it's like, come on, guys. The whole thing is, if it read now with those characters and their obsessions, that's there for a reason, and it's fucking brilliant that it works that way.
a lot of the reason is, frankly, you saw a movie with Kenneth Branagh in it, and this was written 400 years ago to be performed on a stage.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah,
and that's what
everything wrong with School of
Everything.
Yeah, it's just like,
the everything that's wrong with everything podcast, which we should be doing as a spin-off.
Right. Yeah, definitely. The everything wrong with form of criticism. Yeah. Definitely.
But that kind of does link back, because it's a side effect precisely of an overpowering media culture whereby reality as an ideology is constructed by media and then fed to people. Right. So, of course, the natural reaction to that from people is to then, quote unquote, criticize media texts as if they are real.
Yeah, and that's why you get this wonderful, and I know he's a bit of my hobby horse as well, but I remember seeing this such a sweet interview with David Lynch, where someone was saying about the confusion in his films, and he sort of made the slightly academic point that human beings are as much drawn to confusion and chaos as they are to the ideas of enlightenment or whatever. But then he just reverted to type. But that's the best way for him. He said, look. He said, a couple go to watch one of my films. A young couple go to watch one of my films. They go out, and let's say the young woman in the couple, it's a man and a woman. Let's say the young woman is like, I didn't get that. What the fuck was all that about? And they go for coffee, and her boyfriend or the guy she's dating for that particular starts to mansplain to her about all the things that film was actually about. And she sits there with her cup of coffee going, he's wrong. Yeah. That's because she knows what the film is about. He said it's that simple. He said we all actually know because we've just seen it.
Right.
And actually, she's now in a situation where she's listening to someone who doesn't know, but with this immense authority that he does know. But she knows, even though the first thing she came out was, what the fuck's David Lynch on? And what the hell was all that about? She's got a better grasp of my film than the guy who's mansplaining to her it all wrong.
Yeah, because the act of walking out of the cinema confused and fascinated and saying, that's it. That is the meaning of the film. Yeah. But we will insist upon treating texts as if they are as if they're written in code, and what you need is like the key to the cipher, and then you can find what's actually been written there, and then that's what the text means. That's how we teach texts to children in schools now.
True. Yes, it's true. I mean, there is ultimately an anxiety at the heart of it as well, isn't it? It's as though this is something that's deviant. It's acting in defiance of expectation.
Well, it's got to be an obsession. We've got to be able to grasp some form of narrative, because the narrative outside of fiction, the narrative of history, the narrative of our lives, we are so fragmented and so confusing. And it is this sort of immature desire of like, we need something. We need something that we can just...
There's almost a Freudian element to it as well. What this film does, which almost all the films we've spoken about do, is it rakes open that whatever sort of permeable membrane exists between the conscious and the subconscious. This rips open. It just rips it apart, and people don't like that. It's uncomfortable. It spawns nightmares.
It is uncomfortable, but that's part of why this sort of work of art is so valuable. You said earlier that you said a couple of times that this film is profoundly about misogyny, and it absolutely is. And I think it's really interesting to ponder exactly what this film's attitude is towards like giallo films and violent media in general. That's a really interesting thing. But I really don't think that it's the obvious superficial reading, which is that, these movies are misogynistic and therefore, it's not that. What it's going into, I mean, we were gushing, all of us, earlier about Toby Jones, rightfully. And one of the things he gets across so brilliantly to me is that he is by far the quote unquote nicest or most sympathetic man in this entire production process towards the women who are there, and yet he is also clearly in his own way a misogynist, right?
Yes.
That is in him to start with. It is not that watching these depictions of misogynistic violence put that into him. It is that they provide a way that he has never had before to express feelings that he already has.
Yes.
And it's fascinating to me to ponder why the actress Sylvia sort of reaches out to Gilderoy. And I think she is attracted to him, not necessarily sexually or anything like that, but she's attracted to him because he is the least threatening man in that environment. He is clearly the man least likely to grab her ass, frankly, to be crude about it.
Well, yeah, he's the alien, isn't he? He's the one who isn't sort of bound up in this very sort of Italian, very toxically masculine culture.
Yeah, Italianness and maleness in this film are kind of synecdoches for hyper masculine.
They are, and they're bound up with this strange sort of like undercurrent of Catholicism, aren't they? They're bound up with that, which of course relates back to the whole witch persecution
subject matter of the film. And the sheer hypocrisy of the director when he talks about how he's making a sympathetic statement towards the victims, etc.
Oh, you bullshitting asshole, right? I mean, just like, you want to kill him, don't you? You actually want to,
Yeah, but I mean, I think this film is very scathing about the capitalistic production process of these texts. There's loads in it about the people working there are sort of the actresses are kind of doing it on the hope that maybe at some point they'll get paid, and they're rushing it through because obviously there's production schedules. This is one film of the loads of cheap films that their studio pumps out every year, etc., and they keep on getting power cuts, and every time it's like we can't afford to miss a second. We lost 5 minutes there to a power cut. The time pressures, but I think that's all in there. But the other thing that strikes me is particularly about Gilderoy is that she is drawn to him because he seems like the most sympathetic man in that environment. As you say, he's an outsider, etc. He doesn't have the same outward markers of the toxic masculine attitude, and he is not unsympathetic. Like how you read the incredibly intimate scene between them where she talks about the fact that she's been sexually molested by the director, whether you read that as something that actually happens or something that happens in his fantasy or something that happens in this sort of zone where the film has merged with reality, and whether you think that's something that's actually happening or whether that's just psychological or whether you think the distinction is just completely broken down within the main text at this point, whatever you think about it, that scene, Toby Jones plays Gilderoy as genuinely sympathetic to her plight. And what I love about this is that this film manages to get across something that you really don't see faced in many other places, which is that it is possible for a man to have sympathy towards women, to be aware of the fact that they are victimized and abused, etc., to even sort of disapprove of the way men around him behave, and yet at the same time to carry the same sorts of attitudes within him.
Right. I mean, his misogyny just manifests differently, doesn't it? It's fear. It's a phobia, isn't it? He doesn't understand women. They are like an alien creature to him.
Yeah.
But there's something. But there's so much in there about control, isn't it? Because obviously the way that the patriarchy works is
right.
So the thing he can control, he can't control where his receipts are processed. He can't control, but he can control a console. He can control it better than anyone else in the place.
Yeah,
and then
he repeatedly tries to wrest power and status back from the people that have taken away from him through his manipulation of that technical process.
Right,
which is a fascinating commentary in itself of the situation of the worker in the capitalist workplace. Really,
yes,
the skilled worker. Yeah,
and that's absolutely the point. Because what inevitably happens as well in the capitalist mode of production and your work environment as well is if you're receiving information about the value of your work, then because work is all pervasive, and therefore we alienation, classic alienation, we become absorbed in work and so on. Work defines us. People, to wrest back control, he becomes this aggressive He has this aggressive moment of seizing back control. And of course, it means to attack the person he's been sympathetic to hitherto.
Yeah.
And it's such a stark moment because, and it's one of the brilliances of the film, because one part of your brain is going, yes, these bastards have ground him down, and he is the only one who can actually give them the sound design that they can only dream of, because he is a kind of genius. He is a kind of Delia Derbyshire or a Brian Hodge. Oh my God. And the horror, the true horror, is he's going to do it. He feels compelled to do it, this act of control, by hurting.
Violence, right?
Torture,
an act of torture and it's such an extraordinary moment. I mean, it just, the two things just ram together in the middle, and they always cancel each other out, and you're just left with, oh my God, what the fuck do I make of that?
How do I process this?
Yeah.
It's particularly poignant, as Jack was saying, if you're wearing headphones whilst watching it, because that's the point at which the film actually becomes aggressive to its audience as well, because the sound actually hurts you if you've got headphones on. It's not a very pleasant experience at all.
Yeah.
What's fascinating to me as well about that scene where the backup actress is tortured by Gilderoy with the sound through the earphones is that she leaves the headphones on.
Yeah.
She is in pain. She is in dreadful pain. She's being assaulted. She's being tortured, as we say. And yet for a very long time, because she's told to by the male boss stroke employer, she puts up with it.
Right.
And that's kind of the other side of the whole sort of Milgram experiment thing.
That's exactly what I was thinking. It is like the Milgram experiments, isn't it?
Yeah. And the Milgram experiments are kind of complex because there's new information that's come out which suggests that the usual account of them is not kind of crap, because there's loads of stuff that was kind of suppressed at the time about how the willingness of people to administer the quote unquote electric shock was linked to their ability to see through what was happening. You know, we find from some of the notes that have been found, and I think it was only a couple of years ago this came out, is that there was a direct link between the people who were obeying the orders and administering the quote unquote shocks, and there was a direct correlation between the willingness to do that and the ability to see that fakery was going on. So there's an element. What we find is something even more complex and interesting than kind of the standard pessimistic liberal account about how people will just do as they're told, which is that this incredibly interesting example of the reflexive and recursive ways in which so much of social interaction and hierarchical social reaction is a kind of drama.
Yeah, it's a game almost.
Improvised drama or gameplay. Exactly. Yeah. Which is fascinating in this context because this is all about people acting.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's a synthetic environment, isn't it? Nobody needs to be there. They're making a film. Beyond the actors, that they're all playing a role. The producer, the director, the whatever. They're there to perform a particular role. The thing about Gilderoy is that he's got nothing else. That is who he is. That's his life. He's got no identity. So whenever he's in an environment where there are stronger identities or where there is a conflict with that identity, his sense of identity breaks down.
Well, in fact, one of the things that sort of reminded me of, in terms of a kind of, if you could have a classic Gothic touchstone, which was he's Harker in Dracula.
Right.
He just enters this place, which is completely alien, which he is trapped in, and of course we all know the racialist connotations in Dracula as well, of which there are many. Yeah. And
that's
Dracula
filthy foreigner coming into our women's bedrooms and making them like him. Yes,
exactly.
He's also an intensely dominant homoerotic male figure as well.
And Dracula is just splintered into these other men, these Italian men.
Yeah. And Harker is an intensely passive figure in the novel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I'm always amazed when I come back to reread it just how cat and mouse the first chapters are. I mean, Dracula is intensely flirtatious with Harker and bats him around verbally, obviously, playing games with him.
I hate to give him any credit, but that is something that Stephen Moffat tried to bring out in his adaptation.
He did. I mean,
it doesn't work.
Credit where credit's due. He did try for that. He did. Part of the problem was it's Moffat's dialogue, so that doesn't work. But also the casting of Bangus Claes just didn't work. He's just not right.
it's warmed over Joss Whedon dialogue, you know, with inadequate actors.
It's not.
But no, I mean, there's a whole sort of interesting subject here about the oscillation between intense activity and intense passivity in the male protagonists of 19th century fiction.
Right,
it's really interesting.
Well, very often they're entirely passive in many respects because it's all told in retrospect, isn't it? They're all epistemological, right? They're journals and recollections. And I mean, I think in the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's a conversation. It's a conversation between Mr. What's his name?
Mr. Utterson and
Mr.
Enfield.
Right. They're recounting their recollections of what happened to Jekyll and the ostensible Mr. Hyde.
Well, Jekyll is an intensely passive figure, isn't he? He basically, apart from developing the formula, he does nothing. Except he is completely subject to the act. I mean, God, there you go. It's a perfect cameo of the entire thing I was just talking about, that oscillation. You have them both in one text there, the intensely passive Jekyll and the intensely active Hyde.
Yeah.
But I mean, Dickens wrote some of the most incredibly passive. Arthur Clenham, the main male character in Little Dorrit, is just he's so passive. It's incredible.
They're all subjects, aren't they? All the protagonists in sort of fiction of that era, sort of like Victorian era, they are all subjects to the situation. It happens in like H.G. Wells all the time as well. I mean, you look at the protagonist in War of the Worlds. He's just tossed from pillar to post. He doesn't do anything.
No,
it's
exactly.
It's the great sort of pre-modernist form, isn't it? Where the author, God is the author is God, and the situations are going to. It's an interesting how, in some ways, we've sort of come full circle, but with television. So that idea of, I mean, in fact, you know, this is in many respects, Berberian is incredibly modernist in the sense of modernist. Literature and modernist fiction. There's something, even though it's set in the 70s, there's something quite early 20th century about the way that Gilderoy is presented, the way he's sort of wrenched from this kind of pastoral romantic idyll and then, you know, thrust into the inferno. Well, you know, an Italian inferno. And with lines which, you know, some of the lines, you know, they do read as though that they would come. I mean, just out of that sort of late 19th century, but crossing into 20th century, where things are getting a little more taboos are breaking. I mean, I love the line where he says, you know, what's wrong with you English? You don't believe in handshakes, no hugs, no kisses, and it's so playful that it's got. You know, it's just pushing at being transgressive, and
I love that that sort of insistence upon intense physical friendliness towards Gilderoy at the outset as a form of aggression and domination. It's because that's what they're doing. They're asserting their dominance over him. They are saying, you know, I will invade your physical space. I will subject you to a physical contact that you're obviously not comfortable with. I will do that. There's nothing you can do about it. I'm in charge here. It's like the famous Lyndon Johnson handshake, you know, where he because of course Lyndon Johnson was about 8 foot tall, so he would do this very consciously. He would go right up to you. He would grab you by the hand and he'd put his other hand on your shoulder and he'd just look right down at you and physically dominate you. And it was all done with a great big smile on his face, you know. And that's absolutely what they're doing. And there's a sense in which Gilderoy becomes almost like an honorary woman in that scenario, because he's been cast in the role of kind of like the passive subject, or object, I should say, to be ordered around, and then, you know, treated as having subjectivity when it's convenient to the men, and then they just switch that off again when they don't want him to have any anymore. He's even compared to the dog at one point, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's interesting how that control, because we'd said, you know, I mean, they're asserting control over him in that way, and we talked about earlier about how he seizes that control, but in the worst possible way. But I'm fascinated by the ways he maintains control in the moments when he's away from the studio, with that personal collection of sounds from his home. That's a
yeah.
really fascinating addition to that. You know, with the mantle clock and the doorbell and the footsteps. Whether it's a sort of map and compass thing, or whether it's a sense of, well, I have control over this now. These are things I've fully seen from beginning to end. I'm not working to anyone else's vision.
Well, his home, his idea of home, which appears very explicitly later in the film, is explicitly constructed entirely of like media recordings. You know,
Yes.
he brings home with him in the form of like these home recordings of Mum's footsteps, Mum's doorbell, and then later on where we kind of see the scenes which you cannot just say what is happening. Is it, you know, the film and reality merging, or is it the boundaries of the text we're watching breaking down, or whatever? But there's a scene where kind of that itself breaks apart, and almost physically underneath it, in exactly the same way actually that faces break apart and other faces are underneath in the graphics at the start. You see like the Italian film studio reality break apart, and underneath there's pastoral Dorking.
Right, there's a documentary.
It's a nature rambling documentary, and yet that is entirely composed of media. It's composed of, it's not just a shot of the fields around Dorking where he lives. It is a clip from a documentary. It is film of
it's almost as though he
is like a
child of media, isn't he? It's almost like he's constructed himself, right? And that's kind of reinforced by the film, like the notion that when he's constantly trying to reclaim his money for his plane ticket, and they say there was no.
That's incredible.
Because on one level, that's they're fucking scamming him. Right. The next level is like,
are they?
Are they? It's there's little moments like that. There's another
in a lesser film, it would start a sort of chain reaction where you find out, actually Leonardo DiCaprio was a patient all the time. You know?
I mean, actually, because one of the first things you do, the beginning part of the film looks like someone who has been sectioned, but they don't. It looks like the interior of a hospital. And he's wandering along with his overnight bag, or whether he's gone involuntarily, but they don't hang on to it. There's no prestige at the end to say, as you say, DiCaprio. But that thing about the film breaking.
You never see him sort of leave "quote unquote" home and arrive there.
No,
you never see him leave his hotel room and walk through the front door out the studio. He's just and the film is sometimes incredibly cleverly edited so that the two physical spaces just merge into each other. Most particularly, of course, in the bit towards the end where he walks out of his front door and he's just in the studio. But you don't get any "quote unquote" realist shots of him walking out the door at home, walking along the streets, there's the car park, there's the front door. It doesn't happen. He's just in one place and then he's in another.
In a way, it's one of the most. I was just going to say it's probably in a sense the purest example of what Mark Fisher was talking about all those years ago, about nostalgia for lost futures and the hauntology, which obviously he drew from people like Derrida and all that. But this whole idea of that life is constructed out of library music, samples, 1970s documentaries and public information films and vintage recording and
the whole Scar folk
synthesizers, and therefore his Dorking that's all it is. It is, and Dorking is a series of documentary images from a film that he once did the Foley for.
Those insights of Mark Fisher's are very applicable to The Shining, by the way, as well. In fact, Mark Fisher writes specifically about The Shining on the original K-Punk blog. There's one particular entry I always remember, which is about the particular use of 1920s music. The Al Bowley tracks, Midnight, the Stars and You, and It's All Forgotten Now, and about how there's just something to us. There's just something inherently hauntological about those sounds. That particular sound that old records have, and their scratchiness and the everything about it.
So you have this entire film that is constructed out of constructed out of film. It's a film constructed out of film.
Out of mediascapes,
Yeah.
out of mediascapes. I mean, there's even almost like a
Media
supplementary
as a
commentary.
psychological language.
Right. It's almost like it's drawing parallels between the nature of media and memory as the components of constructs of personality. I mean, we know now, of course, that memory is so. What we preconceive of memory in the same way what we preconceive of media isn't absolutely true. Memory is not a record of reality. It's something that we edit, that we transform, that we constantly reimagine and reinterpret as we age and as new biases and contexts develop.
Absolutely. And historical memory the same way.
Right.
Which is why you can end up with something like a real event a real event like the persecution of women as witches. You know, in historical memory as constructed by media texts, specifically, you know, commodified capitalist mass market media texts.
Yeah.
It's reconstructed. Our memory of it, our social memory of it, is of like, you know, women who actually were witches.
Right.
And the reality, as dreadful as it was, gets transmuted from the, you know, the reality of the strappado and hangings and stuff like that into red hot pokers shoved up the reproductive organs in salacious, you know, sexually charged sadistic scenes and stuff like that.
Which you get in What Have You Done to Solange, which is a giallo movie from the 70s, of course. So there it is again, you know. But I think it's a sort of very loaded line in this film, which sort of touches on all these things you're saying. It must have been magpies. Again, when that came out, I thought, that line is another line that's doing an awful lot of heavy lifting. It must have been magpies. That is a fantastically loaded line. The letter from home.
Oh yes, which kind of reflects his own breaking down.
Yeah, but also in the sense of
it also gives the lie
what magpies do. I mean, you know, the theft, the
thieving magpies.
And also the magpies. You instantly think of the two more senior Italian, the director and the supervisor, this line is doing. But even you know, there's something so quaint and, you know, like you do get this idea of, I'll use the term again, of him slipping his moorings when he uses the line, oh yes, you could only go in 2 by 2. I thought, oh, that's 2 at a time. But again, it has that sort of sense of about his own shed, his own workshop back home in Dorking. And you think it's such a small sort of cosmology he has, really. And then and now he's in the abyss.
Right.
The scale is fascinating between him and what he's encountering.
And I think that the letter from home about the chiff chaffs, you know, that kind of is that's the moment where the idea, what you could call the ideology of Dorking in his brain kind of breaks, isn't it? Because he's constructing home as this sort of antithesis to where he is now. And what's, you know, the news from home is from this, you know, absent but you know, incredibly suggestive sort of mother figure is, you know, the chicks are all dead. The chicks have been slaughtered.
Yeah.
And then you get Dorking summoned hauntologically through media texts as just a complete, you know, construction of media images. It becomes increasingly clear that this film isn't sort of saying, it isn't contrasting Dorking as kind of a you know, a Garden of Eden. What it's saying is that's yet another idea that doesn't really. It doesn't really amount to anything because it's just constructed of narrative.
Right. It is as constructed as anything else. And is as prone to corruption. It's as prone to corruption.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is again, it's the thesis of all those linked Lynch movies of like the quaint, eccentric suburbia, and you lift the stone and you see all the wriggly worms underneath the stone in the lovely garden and all the beetles.
There is a kind of delicious nihilism, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think the nihilism is something that he's encountering a bigger world, or a sense of a bigger world, and the darkest aspects of it are overwhelming him.
I mean, he's not built for it, is he? He's not the equal of it.
That it reminded me of do you remember the old film with Malcolm McDowell and David Warner, Time After Time?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
my God.
absolutely hokey film, but great fun. And Malcolm McDowell pursues David Warner through time as Herbert George Wells. And there's this wonderful little scene, beautifully acted scene, where they're in a hotel and H.G. Wells is saying to David Warner's character, who is effectively Jack the Ripper, that's who he is. He said, I've got to take you back to our time. You cannot be here in this time. You'll ruin everything. And he says, why don't you just come and sit next to me? And he switches on the television in the hotel room. And of course, it's scene after scene. He keeps flicking channels, and it's just a documentary on the war. Then it's a slasher movie, and then it's this. And he said, here I'm an amateur. And the reaction.
I gave birth to the 20th century.
Yes, it's right back to From Hell. Yeah, there's just the look on Herbert George Wells being the utopian socialist and everything. It's like the future that you think you're going to get is not coming anytime soon, and his whole worldview crumbles. And it's the sort of same with Gilderoy on a much more on a much subtler level. It's the world. I feared the world would be bigger, and even the sense of like simple unfair moments, like they won't pay me for my receipt, or that they're not being honest about money, and then suddenly there's a big yawning chasm beyond that. And you could look at it as just. I'm going to look at it, but you can see a man being crushed. And
absolutely.
The documentary that's
facts.
named, the sort of nature documentary that's named, is called Local Perspectives.
Oh, brilliant! Absolutely brilliant.
There's some lovely choices on this. Yeah, Local Perspectives at Box Hill.
Yeah, boxes are everywhere.
He's in a box for the entire damn thing.
Yeah, and he kind of moves between the studio and his home, and also between, quote unquote reality and quote unquote dreams, by walking in and out of the wardrobe a couple of times as well, which is direct.
It's like the damn cube, isn't it? It is just a transition between various different boxes and coffins, and
we get the word vortex, of course, and I mean, even the equestrian part of the equestrian vortex, it's like, you're on the back of someone else's horse. You've lost, you're in part control, but also you're having to rely on something else. And the thing he's relying on is falling at the first hurdle,
Well, I think, to hark back to what we were talking about at the start, I think it really is kind of this idea. It's very, very deliberate and laboured about. I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but it's very deliberate about the fact that this is set in this particular historical moment. It's set in the early 1970s, and that we were talking about how that's a moment of profound rupture for Western capitalist societies. And I think if you I don't know how consciously or schematically anybody was setting out to say that, but it certainly works.
Even the power cuts are resonant in terms of the power cuts at home.
And Gilderoy is kind of this he's kind of like, in his situation, he's kind of a cameo of the entire gigantic shift that took place in the economic basis of how culture was produced, and subsequently how we understand the world to a huge extent. He is very deliberately redolent of those sort of the classic figure of the sort of the English eccentric, lone inventor. We've been talking about Doctor Who in this. The original conception of Doctor Who is very much along these lines. He's an eccentric English inventor who sort of has he has a shed, essentially, box that he invents things in, which kind of gets more faithfully represent. The original idea kind of gets more faithfully represented in the two Cushing movies and on television. But that's the idea. And of course, these days it's Matt Smith monologuing about how he's going to save the universe through being amazing. So that is the cultural shift. And you have like Gilderoy, representative of that entire pre-world, signified by things like the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which is the perfect example. It's public service television, and it's people, eccentric, brilliant, synesthesiac artist genius inventors, scientists who were just left in this little department to come up with these amazing ideas that provided just an unmistakable soundscape for culture in that moment,
Right.
And it gets, over the years,
Before the words market fitness came in.
Yes, before the BBC gets, Bertized and Checklandized, etc., etc., and before everything turns into this gigantic, ruthless scrabble to, get the commodity produced as quickly as possible, which is kind of I don't want to make it sound like, pre-neoliberalism that, capitalism was great. I'm not saying that, but there is a, it's true. The world has, since that rupture, the world has become, the spaces for anything other than commodification have narrowed. Let's put it that way.
They've narrowed enormously.
And that's what,
because even
what Gilderoy walks into, isn't he? He walks into the future, and it's the culture shock of that, because his world is dying.
Yeah.
And our world, the world that we end up with, is coming.
His entire situation kind of suggests that, doesn't it? The fact that he is doing this film, which, of course, by his own admission, is something that he wouldn't otherwise do.
Yeah.
Why would he do that? Why would he leave his cozy home and fly to Italy to do this unless he was hard up?
I like the idea that he's there because, somebody told him, come and do the sound work for a film. What's it called? Oh, it's something to do with horses. And he right. Great, a nature documentary about horses. That'll be fun.
I was somewhat reminded of our conversation on one of the previous podcasts when I'd said about the composer Ritz Ortolani waking up in the middle of the night going, I've got to do the score for Cannibal Holocaust because the other people because whoever else does it will do it really badly and they'll accentuate. And I thought, in a way, maybe that could have been a sort of parallel for Gilderoy. It's like he had some idea of what this film was. It's like, no, I've got to deal with that. But even a film. Even these films, I mentioned, What Have You Done to Solange, or the Argento films, everything. They're so alien now. Even the film within the film is so alien to us.
Yeah.
From this perspective, they're extraordinary, for all the reasons that you said at the beginning. But beyond that, beyond their shock value, beyond their misogyny, beyond the extremes they're trying to go and the exploitative, they are extraordinary in so many other ways.
They have a kind of ruthless honesty about them, don't they?
Yeah.
They have a kind of merciless honesty, which, for all that they're exploitative and distasteful in many ways.
Yeah.
There is something preferable about that to the kind of cultural products that seem to be the only thing culture has room for anymore, which are so processed and
micromanaged and processed and
there's
no
rupture
rupture
this as well. The focus group that they've got installed in their heads where you can't put that in because it will alienate these people.
This demographic or that demographic or whatever. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, there is this friction to these films, as distasteful as they can be. There is a genuine sense of friction that creates it creates frisson. There's meaning. There's actually there's some sort of engagement there. Whereas things like your Marvel movies or whatnot, it's Teflon. It's so plastic.
Yeah. And the fact that this movie is also engaged in a technology that has to be manipulated so physically. I love the scene where he's having to loop tapes around pencil, to get the distance on it to get the particular kind of effect. And he did one scene is just the room is filled with tape.
And it looks like he's playing the tape on the room.
Right. And there's also a spiderweb thing going on there.
Of course,
yes, that's right. Yeah. No, but I love that because it does see. You realize sort of rationally what he's doing, but it looks like he's gone mad, and it looks like he's trying to use the real world or his life or his room or whatever, his environment, as kind of a tape player. He's trying to turn the actual physical world he lives in into like a way of playing media.
Again, referring back to the Stone Tape, where that is literally true.
And I guess with all culture makers and whatever they're engaged in, whether it's in writing books or making films or little documentaries or bits of I guess everyone's engaged in the act of metaphorizing the world in an attempt to grasp it. You make a metaphor of it. You make a so certainly linking that idea with the sense of control, where his one moment of control is the moment where he's at his most malignant. It's such a powerful. I meant to take a note of when it appeared in the film as well. I thought this feels like the middle moment.
What's fascinating about that, though, is that you that is open to different interpretations, because you can read it as like Gilderoy's ultimate fall, his ultimate moment of assimilation into this world that is represented both by the content of the film and the production process of the film, his ultimate moment of transition into something like the worldview of the Italian filmmakers, etc. And I don't think you wouldn't be wrong if you thought that, but also at the same time, there is something, you get the feeling after that moment of attack, where you feel like he's kind of broken the film, because the actress does eventually get to the point where she says, fuck this, tears the headphones off and storms out. And after she's gone, the producer, whatever his name is, Francesco, he just comes back into the room and he doesn't shout or he doesn't say anything. He just sort of wanders around and he knocks the chain off the desk, and his entire demeanor is like, well, that's it. That's our last chance. It's gone. We're out of time. We can't, there's no more money or there's no more time.
Yes, there's a sense that he steps on the gas pedal to get to the crisis point.
By doing that, Gilderoy has kind of won and lost simultaneously, because he's merged with this world that has been trying to suck him in the entire time, but at the same time he's sort of broken it.
Yeah.
Because literally the worker has departed. The worker has withdrawn her labor.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
and of course you can't help but notice that he does knock a chain off.
Right.
Of
course.
She has nothing to lose but their chains.
Yeah, now that is fascinating, because Gilderoy has done it by weaponizing his labor.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Which actually turns that on its head, because I know I said earlier that this was almost like that sense of people, sometimes the enormous pressure people are under to justify what their work is in a hierarchy. Particularly if they're put under pressure by bosses, and they have to sort of carve out and say, this is what I do, and it can be done very aggressively. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. There's almost a kind of quasi-heroic moment in there as well of I've now ruptured the entire thing. Okay, it had to be done with an extreme measure, but I've just broken the film in half.
And it's interesting that this precedes the breaking down of the film that you're watching, of course. He's broken everything. He's sort of broken the metaphysics of this engine, this film.
Exactly. At this point, the sort of, in Todorov's distinction, between the marvelous and the uncanny, the one being like something that's a delusion or a trick, and the other being a real supernatural thing. I mean, I love this precisely because it's one of the precious few texts that not only doesn't slip into the sort of the always disappointing, rejection of the genuinely supernatural, but it refuses to even sort of do the still relatively crude thing of specifically going the other way and saying, it's definitely a ghost or definitely
right. I mean,
it just refuses to resolve the distinction at all.
Yeah,
we're now in the phase that the medium itself is the ghost.
Exactly, the medium is the haunting. The medium is the spectre, and the reality and the medium have just merged with each other. Gilderoy, by this point, he's speaking, and his voice has been dubbed by an Italian actor.
Right.
He is now in the film. The film has the narrative in the fictional film has absorbed the production process of itself, its own production process, and as a result, it has absorbed all the people involved in it as well, including Gilderoy, who, ironically, for all his sort of weakness, he's kind of the last holdout because he's the hardest to assimilate.
Because it resets the hierarchy a bit.
The accumulating, absorbing thing. It's
like Jill in the Stone Tape, or
and the hotel in The Shining,
or the
filmmakers in the Blair Witch Project.
That's right.
Of course.
Yes. But yeah, it's like he's broken the creature that has absorbed him by using its own logic, which
yeah. I mean, it's that the dread of, I mean, he literally does deal with loops, life as a perpetual loop. And there he is dealing with them, and the only way you got is to cut through the loop.
Right. I mean, this notion of people breaking the reality in which they operate through their own despair.
Yeah, he's almost it's almost like Sisyphus, really, but he just stops. He stops pushing the rock.
He stops playing the game. Yeah, right. Yeah. He just says, "No, I reject the entirety of it." There's a slight Tyler Durden-ish quality to it.
And that's kind of, another thing you get is people say, the film just sort of stops. Well, yeah, there's nowhere else for it to go.
Right.
It's just collapsed in upon itself.
And that abruptness, that, just in terms of tone, works beautifully. There's this kind of slap across the face quality to it.
Yeah. But you get the feel. I mean, I feel like, in one version of reality, everybody just sort of shrugs their shoulders and Gilderoy gets home somehow, and the film remains on the cutting room floor for the rest of time, etc. Until 40 years later somebody releases a Blu-ray with a cut that they put together. But in another version, looked at a different way of what happened here, Gilderoy just remains standing there staring at that eerie spot on the projector screen just forever, because the distinctions have collapsed to the point that the dialectic can't move anymore, so it just kind of sits there on pause for the rest of time. I
mean, the old white spot that used to appear on the old television sets. That's the most terrifying thing for a program maker, because that you've lost your signal. That's all that's there. But it also is the iris on the spotlight of a projector as well. When it's just that, all the dreams being thrown on that curtain are gone.
I love it.
They've ended. You've now woken up, and the waking nightmare. Well, all you've got is the end credits available to you, because you basically explored the horror of that man's experience and that man's life through his media and another medium. Absolutely. Where can you go after that? I mean,
it doesn't need
already worked it through in the box. I mean, it's Oblivion. Real life is Oblivion now.
It doesn't need any sort of contrived or synthetic conclusion. Where
it would have been so cheap as well.
It would
just to see the shed door opening and him stumbling out or something. Don't do this to us.
Oh, that was a weird dream.
Yeah. Wow. Yes.
And then the phone rings. Hello, Gilderoy. I've got a job for you in Italy. Close up on Toby Jones' face.
That would have happened. Cue the silhouette of the woman dancing on the roulette table. Unexpected, whatever it was. In a sense, it says something about being able to, almost take from street level and take it up to high art, or invert that. Because actually, there's a lot to be said about aesthetics, because it could so easily be the plot of something like one of those old Tales of the Unexpected, or one of those old Hammer House of Horror things. You just put that kind of cheap prestige on the end or whatever, and it would fit entirely in the middle of a season of one of those early 80s anthology series.
Zone, something to that effect.
Yes, yeah. But again, it's things from a certain genre are treated with a certain kind of care, and how they transcend. I think even if Berberian Sound Studio had turned up in a Tales of the Unexpected with all those hokey things, it would still be kind of good. But because you'd be able to see the thing within the thing. But this scales it in such a really interesting.
But to take something like this that could so easily be pulp, or in another era would have been pure pulp, and to develop it and transform it in this way without pretension. I mean, that's great.
That's it. Yeah. That is such a key thing, isn't it? I mean, there are several points in this where it could have so easily tipped over into pretension. I mean, one of them we highlighted earlier, where the sound just disappears.
Yeah.
It could have so easily come across as terribly pretentious, but it doesn't ever.
No, there's something about the beginning of the film where it just feels like such a workaday Channel 4 film,
Mm-hmm.
British film, that grounding does it enormous favors.
Yeah.
Although
Yeah, I think so.
having said that, I would like to see like a Twilight Zone where John Landis gets sucked into his own segment of the Twilight Zone movie and gets his own head cut off for his incompetence.
Oh yes, Vic Morrow. Yeah. God.
Oh wow.
That is extraordinary.
The
Extraordinary how Landis sort of carried on.
Right.
But I mean, I think he had another film out like the following year. It's like,
Yeah, well,
it's just mind-boggling.
but it's even that kind of refers back, because there's that wonderful sort of bone-chilling moment. It's almost at the middle of the film where you get the crucial, I think, scene where Gilderoy sort of strongmanned into. By the way, doing work outside what he's supposed to be doing, is being asked to do the Foley work, because Massimo and Massimo are sick, and he's being asked to provide the Foley for the scene where the woman is sexually tortured with the poker, and he can't do it. He's too demoralized and disgusted by what he's watching, and the producer Francesco comes and bawls him out, and he says to him, what you need to do if you're going to be a professional is just keep your feelings to yourself, don't say anything, obey orders, do as you're told. And of course that this chimes with the constant repetition of the red sign, the silencio sign. It's about how essentially decent, harmless people end up getting sucked into. I think you can certainly talk about it in terms of fascism.
I was going to say fascistic regimes.
Certainly, because Auschwitz had people whose job there was to mop the floors and shit like this. It wouldn't work. But you don't have to confine it to that. You don't have to. No. It can be read in terms of the rise of fascism, particularly with the Italian connection. You don't have to confine it to that. You can talk about it very directly in reference to the organized historical horror that the film directly references, which is the witch hunts.
Of course,
But you can apply it to all sorts. Sadly, all sorts.
Basically,
of things
the workplace. Even the conversation about remuneration is so on point when he says, "Well, you're an artist. You should be doing this for the." I mean, Jesus Christ, how many conversations that I have in the early years of, well, do you want to do this for something for your show reel?
Working for
this is a profit share, but you've had to pay for your lights, you've had to pay for your stage to be set. No, I'm not doing it.
And systems of abuse and exploitation and cruelty like that, from the relatively petty to the almost world-shatteringly awful, they depend upon a hell of a lot of people who, it's like, I always think of that line from Orwell, as I write this, men are flying above me. He wrote it during the height of the Blitz. Men are flying above me in airplanes trying to kill me. And if we met in ordinary times, that we'd probably shake hands and be perfectly nice to each other. They're normal guys with families, etc. And it depends. All these systems of horror depend upon guys who just turn up and don't let their own feelings about it get in the way. They just do as they're told and pocket their pay and
the peer points.
And they say, well, it's just my job.
Oh, it's my job.
I was just doing my job.
I was doing my job.
Yeah. And the other thing that's needed is silence. Silencio.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course.
And that leads to situations like another wonderful scene is the bit where Sylvia and Gilderoy are alone, and she asks to do. She says, "My throat doesn't hurt anymore. I want to do my scream again." He says, "You don't need to," and she says, "No, I do. I need to scream." And the sound box becomes like this private space where you can give vent to your, she's taken it over. It's the site of exploitation where she's enacting misogynistic violence for these people that are exploiting her. But she's turned it into a place where she can privately, and in a place when, nobody else can touch her, she can express the rage and frustration she feels. And then it leads to her, rather than making her passive, that leads to her saying, right, fuck this. And she destroys, she withdraws her labor.
Right. Literally destroys the product of it.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, I love this film.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it is a
it's
superb. It's superb. I mean, it's not an easy watch. It's not even a pleasant watch at times. You know, it's a difficult film to watch.
Well,
but it
just the constant screaming. You know,
right?
the
It's
constant women screaming is upsetting.
It's
I
a
mean,
very
and
intense.
of course, it's
piece of
always
work.
difficult to watch films where the tenor of them is the lead character and others are relentlessly bullied.
Right.
I mean, that's hard to watch.
I normally can't cope with stuff like that. So it's a measure of how well done it is that I can cope with it, to be honest.
Exactly, but there's something, I think because it's working to such a clear, I mean, not clear as in free of ambiguity, because we've discussed there are plenty of ambiguities in it, but there's a very
the
strong...
ambiguities are clearly stated.
That's the best way to explain it, I think. Yeah.
The ambiguity is the vision, isn't it? It's the vision of the film. So, but
I love how these kinds of things pop. It's rather like The Witch.
Yes.
Again, we've got another sort of young director. It sort of seems to have. I think there was one picture he'd done previous to this, which wasn't terribly well known, and the fact that we can still get these kinds of things that just pop through,
right?
And of course they inevitably pop through because they seem to erupt out of a kind of frustration with everything else. So that they're bound to get through. But even watching it again, and Jack said something earlier, this film does seem as though someone just basically decided to put loads of things together they knew I would personally like. I think what is the because you're inundated with it, you can't help but think it at some point. What was the commercial? How did they do it? How did they say to people, distribute this film?
Can you imagine the script landing on a boardroom and people, potential investors or whatever, studio people reading this script?
I mean, the only thing you can sort of, if you get into the mind of one of those awful bean counters, is it's cheap. It's all in one place. There's no location filming, and maybe that was it. But I mean, I would have been fascinated to know how he sold it, particularly off the back of almost nothing. I mean, it's very early in his career. He hadn't done anything of note, which could have given him the power to be able to go, this is my film. It
doesn't even have any clear touchstones, does it? So it's not like you could have gone to a potential investor or studio and said, "Oh, it's like this. We're trying to do something like this."
No. It really does stand out on its own as being,
It probably got a relatively small amount from various different investors.
Yes, I did notice that it was
incorporate themselves as film companies,
national
and
lottery funding and things like that.
So
that was all at the beginning.
This is a common thing. You very often these days with films, you get 5 minutes of logos before the film starts because the funding is drawn from 17 different sources, all of which have incorporated themselves as a film studio for the purposes of giving, a relatively small amount to this film, that film, and the other. And I think Toby Jones is bankable within, certain parameters. He is a name within his context.
Definitely.
Yeah. And there are investors out there who are sort of serious film buffs and cineasts who are interested in furthering, certain artistic projects. I mean, it's a crude oversimplification to just talk about, the film industry being completely composed of just a monolithic, naked venal.
Yes.
It still exists.
It's just that it's just so much of it.
It's shrinking
to wade through.
Like all the Pacific islands, it's getting smaller and smaller every year.
Because I mean, usually it's just that thing of if someone's got a name, that they can get there through their unusual little small project. I mean, something like a Jim Jarmusch with Patterson, maybe, a film almost about nothing, yet also a wonderful film. But he's Jim Jarmusch, this is how to have come through, I think, certain particular avenues, like, maybe very much as Jack said, it's a conglomeration of different little bits of funding here and there.
It's a different funding model, isn't it? You donate a relatively small amount to lots of little productions, and you turn a nice profit overall from the fact that they all do relatively good business for the kind of thing they are. Instead, I suppose it's a safer bet than sort of putting a huge amount on a very expensive movie. To be honest,
I don't know what its standing.
It's just a bit like diversifying your portfolio.
Yeah. A put option. But I don't know what its standing is, because it's, in a sense, it's not a genre. It straddles genres. I don't know what its standing is in.
It doesn't have a genre. I mean, it's a psychological horror, I suppose. That's probably
I suppose. Yeah.
Except that it's kind of. Is it a horror film?
I think it kind of deliberately defies, doesn't it? Any attempt to classify. And I imagine that's part of its strength and part of its weakness as well, because it is not as well known as most of the more obscure things we've spoken about.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
And I think it's absolutely one of the best films of the last 10 years. I really do.
It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. It is a stunner of a film that will stay with you after you've watched it. It will resonate for a very long time after.
I think it's going to be one of those pieces that people discover. Yeah, they'll get led to it. They'll get led back to it, and I think it's always going to be that. This was made
right
kind of movie. I think that I think it'll last. I think maybe in sort of 20-25 years time, people go, there was this film from the from like 2012, and it's like, oh my god, what's this? I think that's going to be its power. That's the way it's going to last. It's going to be something that people will discover.
Yeah, that sort of cult
through like a sort of circuitous route. Not necessarily an obvious cult film either, but it's going to be a little bit of a word of mouth, a little review here, a little retrospective there, and then people will lead back to it. And I think that's going to be its the way it lasts.
Yeah, maybe somewhere down the line it'll have a sort of resurgence because some critic will talk about it or something.
Yeah, because the only way you can imagine it being put on terrestrial television is at something like midnight on Channel 4.
Yeah, it's going to be
not going to be put on like at 8 o'clock or anything.
I know Mark Kermode liked it when it came out.
Oh yeah.
And it was one of those things that was talked about at the time, because some things just come and go.
Because I remember thinking, that's something that's very much my wheelhouse. I
think that may be where I came to it, actually, the Mark Kermode review.
Could have been me, yeah. I just think once that all the, I mean, Toby Jones, as you said, for a certainly at that point, it was, he was a bit more of but he was just enough of a known quantity,
right?
And he's like, that could be interesting. He's really good, and just saying anything about that kind of a film about analog sound that drives people mad. I'm in. take my 15 quid or whatever it would have been back then.
I tell you, on the sort of watching it, one of the things that struck me was the wonderful charts that we keep on getting glimpses of. The time charts of the film, where they show, this is the event, and they've got minutes down the side, and there's a bar which tapers off down into an arrow, and it shows, this is this sound effect, and there's another bar on the next column along that's another sound effect, where here is like courtyard sounds, riding crops, horses' hooves, etc., and then so and so screams, and then there's another bar that's for the music and stuff. And I was watching it, and I mean, firstly, it profoundly reminded me of two things. I went to one of the things I studied at college, aside from doing my A-levels, was radio journalism. I used analog tape material. I learned how to cut tape and edit tape, for broadcast. I did all this, and it reminded me strongly of that. And the other thing it reminded me of, especially those charts, was when I was studying journalism, it was just before like every single newsroom in the country got totally computerized. So I had the opportunity as part of my course to visit newsrooms, actual sort of newspaper newsrooms, where everything, like the typesetting, was still being done manually, with paper.
Wow.
Instead of on computers. And this is, as I've said, sort of with The Shining, this is kind of a world that I almost or just about remember. It's gone now. It's gone with the wind, but
kind of dying at the time.
The other thing that really struck me when I watched it this time round was looking at those charts with the bars for the different tracks.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at it, I was thinking, that's an Audacity window. It's that's an Audacity window.
I love those moments. I loved those charts because of the way they're framed. They are framed as though they are occult texts or like some kind of arcane ritual.
Yeah,
There's something really sinister
that they are splashed with something. Tea, blood.
Yeah.
Ink. What is that? It's never specific, and I love those little splashes.
And the way as the realities and the both Gilderoy's reality and the world he's wandered into, and the reality of the film as text and the reality of the film as fictional world sort of all crash into each other. We get all these quick shots of those charts intercut with the letters from his mother and the list of sound effects that he's brought with him. Postcards from Dorking, etc. It's
so clever. It's all these different divergent realities, like the schematics for them converging and breaking down, just every parameter just collapsing in on itself. Love it.
But it's interesting how there's enough distance between the 70s and now in terms of technology that the way those extreme close-ups of contact switches and within the context of the film, it's almost like physical incantations because they are distant. It's like you're not pressing a touch sensitive screen or you're activating an app. You are pulling down a lever, and now it's
arcane, isn't it? It is something arcane.
It's so suggestive of something of immense power. I guess it's because the way these things are sort of concertinaed. Now, watching something very, very simple on film of someone activating a contact switch or activating the lever on a bank of tape is akin to James Whale's Frankenstein. Because the whole thing's become concertinaed, and yes, we're in the context of a film that's doing particular things, but the technology itself has become kind of gothic. It's become
because it's the revenant of a past era.
The sound, a contact switch clicks over and we get and it's like whoa.
It's presented in this film in the same way that certain gothic fiction would present certain artifacts of like arcane science or alchemy. So it's the potion that Jekyll creates. It's the unspoken
almanac with the leather binding and the cracked binding.
It's the unspoken means by which Victor Frankenstein creates life, which of course in the book is completely unspoken. There's no machines or lightning or anything like that. There's no it's alive, oh god. It's not that.
Just terrifying encounter on the stairs.
That's it
instead, which is still gives me a
the method in the book is wonderfully occluded. It's just and then I worked for a long time and then I figured out how to do it.
And it's essentially the same life, and that's it.
Essentially, the same thing happens in Jekyll and Hyde as well. Jekyll's own account at the end is just like, and I worked and worked and worked, and eventually I realized how to do it, and then I did it.
I did. In fact, because it's great, it's wonderful. I mean, like the details in Jekyll and Hyde in particular. One of the ones I love is that I know we're going off piece here a bit, but towards the end when he's stuck in the form of Edward Hyde and he's trying to recreate the formula so he can get back to being Henry Jekyll, he can't do it because, and the conclusion he comes to is there was some imperfection or tainted element in one of the salts that he used that he can't replicate.
He can't replicate it. I remember, there's that wonderful thing where he's trying to get salts from all sorts of different places, isn't he? It's really, really tense.
But even that is only Jekyll's interpretation of
Yes. from my reading of that is the reason he can't expel Hyde, I suppose, is because he is Hyde.
Yeah,
Hyde and Jekyll
doesn't want to go.
Separate. Well, no, they're not separate. They're not separate. There is this misunderstanding of that book. There is this incredible misunderstanding, which is that Hyde is somehow some dark avatar. He's all the evil of humanity. He's the evil within Jekyll. He's the dark side of Jekyll. He's not. He's not. The book very early on makes explicit that the appetites that drive Hyde are in Jekyll. He creates Hyde as a kind of mask for the appetites that he follows. It's an excuse.
Yeah, no,
it's not Jekyll. It's not also. It's not just a mask going on. It's a mask being lifted because Jekyll is bound by Victorian bourgeois society.
This is it. It's a book about repression.
It is about repression. It's a sort of personal revolt against that.
Right.
I do all the things that this will not allow.
Jekyll still does them.
He still does.
There is a point early in the book where it talks about it. Never explains what they are, what his nightly excursions are about. I interpret them in a very particular way, obviously, but it never talks about what his nightly excursions are. But he does go and do them.
The book is not the book. People think it's about Jekyll is the
duality
good one,
of man,
Hyde is the bad one. The book is about the opposite of that. It's about how pure moral categories are completely unsustainable.
Right.
Jekyll, you're absolutely right. Jekyll does all the stuff that Hyde does. It's just Hyde is how Jekyll does it without worrying. That's it. Yeah. Jekyll is terribly afraid of his social standing and of what his friends will think, and the fact that he'll be cast out of polite Victorian society. As Hyde, he can follow them without any of that restraint, any of that restriction. And it's also about the notion that repression breeds monsters within us. Clearly, we need to dedicate an entire podcast to talking about this book.
Yeah, well, it's one of my favorite books.
It is.
It really is. It's a stunner. It's a stunner of a book, that one.
Same.
Particularly from a period where a lot of fiction I find very difficult for lots of different reasons. But I think that book, that and Frankenstein.
And Stevenson is just such a prose stylist. He's so great. I mean, reading Jekyll and Hyde. It's almost physical pleasure for me.
Yeah,
the prose is so great. It's
beautiful.
I think Jekyll and Hyde falls into a similar kind of thing, oddly, but I'll try and clear what I'm saying, as Great Gatsby, in that they are almost unadaptable because they are such works of prose, such singularly fascinating works of prose, and their power comes through their prose.
Absolutely. Well, the big problem that most of the adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde come across is they don't know how to do the distinction between Jekyll and Hyde, because in the book, Hyde is not hideous. He's just a man.
He just looks tiny as well. He's a diminutive, just a slight, small guy, isn't he?
His appearance is unstable. Different people perceive Hyde in different ways. Mm-hmm. He's never actually described. People talk about him in generalities.
Yeah, right.
And he is definitely not physically similar to Jekyll. The adaptations always have Hyde played by the same actor with big bushy eyebrows or something.
It's a huge mistake.
Ironically, I've always thought that the perfect person to play Hyde in an adaptation would be Toby Jones. But he's physically completely different to Jekyll. They're different ages, they're different heights, they're different colorings, but we never get a full description of Hyde because some people see him in different ways. Some people see him as very thin, some people see him as sort of bulky, some people see him, he's described as simian by some people.
Right. The only thing he's unstable. There is a description by Utterson when he first meets him, and what you get is he says that there is nothing abnormal about Hyde. There is nothing,
but he gives an impression of deformity.
Right. He's got this uncanny aura that excites negativity. Even Utterson feels violent around him, and Utterson is like the most shy, retiring person imaginable.
That brilliant bit where Enfield is telling Utterson about him for the first time, and he says, myself and the doctor, we looked at each other and we both knew what we were thinking, and what they're both thinking is that they want to kill him.
They want to kill him, right?
Yeah.
There's because something elementally negative. Yeah,
and it's not very PC because it's described specifically as giving an impression of quote unquote deformity.
Yes, that's exactly what it says. That is exactly an impression of.
Yeah, there's no specific deformity, but he gives the impression.
Probably one of the the better realizations comes in, unfortunately, not a particularly great adaptation. But when they made the decision with Spencer Tracy to actually not put any makeup on him,
right,
he just fixed his expression differently. Unfortunately, it's a very minor film. It's not particularly great, but having had the sort of Frederick March, all the makeup and so on, and then when in the Spencer Tracy film they don't do that. They don't do anything, I think.
And yet the interesting thing about the Spencer Tracy film version is that they go out of their way to make Hyde into an emotionally and sexually abusive misogynist.
Yes, that's true. Yes, that's true.
They pick it out in Jekyll as well. The Jekyll version of the character, kind of has this it's very relevant to Berberian Sound Studio and Gilderoy, because the misogyny and the abusiveness towards women is kind of there latently in Jekyll when he first encounters the Ingrid Bergman character, and then it's when he's Hyde that he actually goes and seeks her out and turns her essentially into his abused partner, his sex slave. It's not a good film, but it is kind of
those
startling
little points.
It has ideas. It has interesting ideas. Do you know what is a very good adaptation, which really surprised me? My very first exposure to it, which is the Ladybird book, the children's Ladybird book.
I had those.
Yeah, they were great.
It's really fantastic. Good. It's really good.
I had all of those. I had the
Frankenstein one,
Dracula,
the Frankenstein. It's great, so good. What
I can still hear it. I can still hear
I could see all the pictures that were in that. What surprises me about them is they don't stint. They're actually very, very, very faithful, sort of like Bowdlerized adaptations.
There's one illustration from the Dracula one where it's an illustration of Van Helsing and Arthur Homewood and so on in the churchyard watching Lucy after she's become a vampire returning to her crypt, and it's this wonderful sort of grey blue misty foggy churchyard, and you get like silhouettes of gravestones that are sort of tilted off to one side, and you have the silhouette of Van Helsing, who's kind of this rotund little old chap, and he's sort of pointing over towards this white wraith-like figure who's drifting through the graveyard towards the crypt door. And to me, it is the definitive illustration of that moment. And it's terrifying.
Right. The illustrations in these books are really frightening. They are really atmospheric. I mean, I will always
it makes me laugh, because I was given these when I was very young, and like the Frankenstein one, it puts all the stuff in there about the monster strangling the little boy to death.
It does.
It's all in there.
The killing of Victor's wife, all of that is in there. It's all part of it. It's very dark. It's very
made of very stern stuff.
Yeah, clearly. But
that was a wonderful time, because I remember being given them, and it was all around a time when Channel 4 were doing. I mean, it was all sort of my entry level into the genre in terms of the storytelling. So obviously with those books, but I was always my father would persuade my mother that Friday night he can watch a Universal. They were rerunning the Universal horror movies, so they went through Dracula, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Invisible Man. They went through, and then by the time they got through them, then they went on to Hammer. So I was a little bit older. My dad said, "You can stay up and watch Hammer now," and it was it was all bound to happen, really, wasn't it? But thank God for Channel 4 back then.
And on that note, gentlemen, I think we're drawing to a close at this point.
I think so. We're pushing 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
It's, again, barely scratched the surface.
Right. I mean, it is one of those texts. It is like The Shining and like all the very best of the work we've discussed. Really, it's so difficult to get anywhere near a satisfying depth, because there's just too much.
The diagnosis of misogyny and how it works is profound. It's really detailed and brilliant, and the stuff it has to say about why we find analog so satisfying, I think that's fascinating. There's so many, there's so many avenues you could go in if you wanted to make this a 4-hour podcast. But as you say, it's gone on long enough.
And do we have any clue as to our next venture?
I kind of picked this one, so I'm inclined to throw it open to you guys to decide between yourselves where we want to go next.
What did we talk about? I mean, we talked about Legion at one point, didn't we?
Legion
was
I really want to do that.
Should we do that? There you go.
Should we do Legion? I mean, I would very much like to rewatch that.
That would be great.
Would be very nice to watch.
Yeah, and then we'll think maybe about Don't Look Now after Legion.
Which,
oh wow.
Which Berberian reminded because it lifted that lovely scene of the dropped red onto the film stock. I thought, Don't Look Now. Don't Look Now.
Yeah. I feel like poor old Legion is going to be kind of a byway because it doesn't quite fit into the thread we're following.
Legion's a slightly different.
We'll call it a palate cleanser, I think.
We'll call it just a little stop off. Before we get back onto the main
on our circuitous route.
Yeah. But we do want to do it, so let's do it.
Yeah, definitely. Just for the crack, just for the fun, right?
Just for fun, yeah. Okay. Lovely, great. Okay.
George C. Scott, right? He is the linchpin. He's the connection.
Yeah.
Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
That'll do.
It'll do.